The boy had been standing in the snow for 40 minutes before anyone noticed he was crying. Not the loud kind of crying, not the kind that made people stop and ask questions. The silent kind, the kind a child learns after years of being told that tears don't fix anything, that the world doesn't slow down for grief, that you either keep moving or you get left behind in the cold. He was 11 years old and he already knew all of that. He'd learned it the hard way. He'd learned it in the particular silence of a house where a father used to be. The jacket he was holding was almost as big as he was, and somewhere inside that garage, where 40 motorcycles sat idling like a metal heartbeat, where the smell of exhaust and burnt oil rolled out through the open bay doors in gray waves, was the man his father had told him to find. If you ever find a biker wearing the same patch, boy, you give him my jacket. His father had said it like a prayer, like an instruction only meant to be followed after everything else had already failed. Everything else had already failed. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because the stories on this channel will wreck you in the best possible way. Every week we bring you cinematic biker fiction that goes places most storytelling doesn't dare. Hit the like button if you're already feeling it. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to Black Ridge, Montana. Let's go back to the boy in the snow, because what happens next is going to change everything. Black Ridge, Montana sits in a bowl of mountains that the rest of the country forgot sometime around 1987 when the Caldwell Mining Company shuttered its last shaft and took 300 jobs with it into the ground. What was left behind was a town the size of a bruise, a gas station, a diner that changed ownership 4 times in 10 years, a sheriff's substation staffed by one deputy who spent most of his shift asleep, and a 2-lane highway that connected Black Ridge to the outside world, the way a fraying rope connects a drowning man to a dock. Technically present, functionally unreliable. It was the kind of place where people who had nowhere else to go ended up staying forever. The kind of place where secrets didn't get buried so much as they got absorbed into the landscape, into the rock and the pine and the frozen creek beds that only ran clear in June. The kind of place that looked innocent from a distance and felt, up close, like something had gone terribly wrong here a long time ago and nobody had ever properly dealt with it. The boy's name was Gage Mercer. He was 11 years old, narrow-shouldered, with dark circles under his eyes that had no business being on a child's face. He'd taken the Greyhound bus from Billings alone, carrying a backpack and the jacket and a folded piece of paper with an address written on it in his aunt's handwriting. She hadn't come with him. She'd handed him the bus fare and the paper and told him that whatever happened, whatever those people said to him, he needed to come back before dark. She hadn't explained why. She never explained anything. That was the other thing Eli had learned early. The adults around him communicated primarily in things they didn't say. The garage was called Rourke's, and it sat at the northern end of Black Ridge's main strip, like a punctuation mark at the end of a bad sentence. It was big enough to hold 6 vehicles at once, and today it held motorcycles, dozens of them parked in loose formation across the lot and spilling out onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. Some were old, panheads and shovelheads and iron heads with chrome that caught the pale December sun and threw it back in cold flashes. Others were newer but deliberately worn, leather saddlebags cracked with use, windshields scratched to translucence, handlebars wrapped in black tape that had been replaced so many times the layers had fused into something almost sculptural. The men who owned them stood in clusters outside the garage bay, drinking bad coffee from paper cups, not talking much. They were older, most of them 50, 60, a few pushing 70, with the particular physical economy of men who had spent decades doing hard things and had learned to conserve movement the way people in cold climates learn to conserve heat. Their cuts were black with worn silver lettering across the back. The top rocker read Iron Covenant MC. The bottom rocker read Montana. In the center, a patch Eli didn't fully understand. A crossed wrench and a compass rose, both overlaid on a mountain silhouette. But underneath it, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look, stitched in thread so dark it nearly disappeared against the leather, was a second patch. A smaller one. A private one. Eli knew that patch. He'd been staring at it his whole life. It was sewn into the jacket he was holding. He'd approached 3 men already. The first one had looked at him and looked away, which was its own kind of answer. The second had told him this wasn't a place for kids and that he should go wait inside the diner. The third, a heavy man with a white beard and a voice like gravel in a blender, had asked where his parents were. When Eli told him his mother was dead and his father was gone, the man's expression had done something complicated and then closed like a door. He'd said, "Son, I'm sorry, but we're not the people you're looking for." The snow had started about 20 minutes after that. Just a suggestion of it at first, thin flakes that dissolved before they hit the ground. And then something more serious, heavier, deliberate, the kind of snow that meant business. Eli's jacket, his own jacket, the thin one, the one his aunt had bought from the Walmart clearance rack, was not adequate for this. He'd known that before he left Billings. He'd brought it anyway because the alternative was wearing his father's jacket, and that felt like a line he wasn't ready to cross. He wasn't ready to give it away either. But his father had said. His father had been very specific. He was still standing there holding the jacket, snow collecting on the shoulders of his thin coat, when the garage bay door swung open and a man stepped out. Not the kind of man you failed to notice. He was tall, not unusually so, but he carried himself with the particular verticality of someone who had learned to take up space intentionally, as a habit born of necessity rather than arrogance. His face was a document of difficult history. A scar ran from his left jaw down to the edge of his collar, not clean enough to be surgical, old enough to have settled into the landscape of his skin like a river that had been running a long time. His hair was steel gray, cropped close. His eyes were the specific color of winter sky just before it decides to do something serious. Not quite blue, not quite gray, somewhere in between and not particularly interested in committing to either. His cut was older than the others. Heavier, too, with patches that had been earned rather than purchased. And in the center of his chest, above the Iron Covenant emblem, a single name tab, Graves. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and he was scanning the lot with the automatic assessment of a man who had spent years in situations where knowing your perimeter was not optional. He did this sweep in about 4 seconds, and then his eyes found Eli. He didn't look away. He crossed the lot without hurrying, 12 feet, 15 feet, and stopped in front of the boy with the cup of coffee still in his hand, and his eyes doing something that Eli couldn't quite read. Not pity. Something more complicated than pity. "You've been standing out here a while," Graves said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "You waiting for somebody?" Eli hesitated. He'd rehearsed this. He'd rehearsed it on the bus and in the diner across the street where he'd eaten half a grilled cheese sandwich and stared at the garage through the window for 40 minutes before his courage ran out and he forced himself to walk over. He'd had words prepared. A whole careful explanation. Instead, what he said was, "My dad told me to find someone." Graves looked at the jacket folded over the boy's arms. He didn't reach for it. He didn't ask about it yet. He just looked, and something behind his eyes went very still. "What's your name?" "Eli. Eli Mercer." Nothing moved in Graves' face. Nothing moved at all. But his grip on the paper cup tightened just slightly, and the coffee stopped steaming, or maybe the wind shifted, or maybe Eli was watching so hard that he was imagining things. Later, he would never be sure. "How old are you?" 11. "You come here alone?" "Yes, sir." Graves looked past him at the highway, at the thin scatter of buildings on the far side, at the snowfield beyond the tree line that ran up toward the mountain. He looked for a long time, like he was checking something against a map only he could see. Then he looked back at Eli. "Whose jacket is that?" And Eli said, "My dad's. His name was Danny Mercer. He disappeared when I was 5. The paper cup hit the gravel. Not dropped. Released. With the deliberate control of a man who understood that if he didn't set it down voluntarily, his hand was going to crush it. Graves crouched down until he was eye level with the boy, which was a thing adults almost never did, and which immediately made Eli distrust him slightly less. "Say that name again," Graves said quietly. "Danny Mercer." "And the jacket?" His voice was controlled. Very controlled. "Can I see the collar?" Eli held it out. Graves took it carefully. The way you take something that might be fragile, or might be evidence, or might be both, and turned back the collar. And there it was. The small patch, dark thread on dark leather, almost invisible. A second compass rose, this one oriented differently than the one on the club cuts. private, internal. The kind of marker that meant something specific to a specific group of people and meant nothing at all to anyone else. Graves went absolutely still. The snow kept falling. A man behind them, one of the older riders who'd been watching from 10 feet away, said, "Graves, what is it?" Graves didn't answer right away. He was staring at the patch with an expression that Eli couldn't name. He'd seen grief before. He'd grown up marinating in low-grade grief the way other kids grow up with background noise. This wasn't quite that. This was something that predated grief, something that had been waiting a very long time to be confirmed and was now being confirmed, and the confirmation was not a relief. "Get everybody inside," Graves said. "Right now." "What's right now, Decker?" The man named Decker moved, and Graves stood up and looked at Eli and said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that is not calm but is the thing that holds itself together in the absence of calm. "How much do you know about your father?" "Not much," Eli said honestly. "That's why I came." Graves looked at him for another long moment. Snow on his gray hair, snow on his shoulders, that terrible stillness. "Okay," he said finally. "Come inside." The clubhouse attached to Rourke's garage was not what Eli expected, though in fairness, he didn't know what he'd expected. Something more dramatic, maybe, more threatening. What he got was a large room with concrete floors and mismatched furniture, a collection of wooden chairs and a sagging leather couch and a long folding table covered in paper coffee cups, with photographs covering one entire wall from floor to ceiling. Framed, unframed, thumbtacked directly to the wood. Motorcycles and men in various configurations across what looked like several decades. Rallies, roadsides, hospital parking lots, funerals. One of the photographs was circled in black marker. The circle was old, the marker faded, but Eli could see it from across the room. He could see the face inside the circle. He crossed to it without meaning to, pulled by something he didn't have a name for, and stood in front of it. The photograph was maybe 8 by 10, mounted in a plain black frame, slightly tilted. It showed 6 men standing beside a row of motorcycles on a mountain road, pine trees behind them, snow in the distance. They were laughing at something outside the frame. All of them young, 20-something, 30 at most, with the raw, unguarded quality of people who haven't yet learned to protect their faces. The third man from the left. Eli pressed one hand flat against the wall to hold himself steady. The third man from the left had Eli's jaw and Eli's nose, and Eli's specific way of holding his shoulders slightly forward, as if braced against weather. I was younger in the photograph than Eli had ever seen him, younger than the handful of images his aunt kept in a shoebox under her bed, the ones she'd let Eli look at on certain occasions with the careful gravity of someone handling something irreplaceable. "That's your dad," Graves said from behind him. Not a question. "Yeah. He was 23 in that picture." "When was it taken?" 1997. A pause. 7 years before he disappeared. Eli kept his hand on the wall. He was doing the math, and the math was doing something to his chest. 7 years before his father disappeared. His father had been a member, had been here, had stood in this room, had known these men before Eli was even born, before his mother was in the picture, and nobody had ever told him. Nobody had said a word. "He was one of ours," Graves said. There was a quality to his voice that Eli associated with people carrying weight that had been on their backs too long. "He was with us for about a decade. A brother. One of the best road captains we ever had." Another pause, longer this time. "We were told he died 6 years ago, that there was an accident on Highway 2 in February, and that the wreckage went into a ravine, and that nothing was recovered." "He didn't die," Eli said. "I know that now." Graves came to stand beside him, looking at the photograph. "What I don't know is what happened instead." The other men had filed in, 7 of them, ranging from mid-50s to late 60s, all of them in their cuts, all of them looking at the jacket that Decker had placed on the long table. They were not talking. The room had the specific quality of men who knew how to hold themselves quiet when quiet was required. "Eli." Graves turned to face him. "Before I ask you anything else, are you safe? Does anyone know you're here?" "My aunt." "Your aunt?" He absorbed this. "Is she—" He stopped, started again. "Is she someone we should be worried about?" It was an odd question, an adult-shaped question, the kind that carried more weight than its surface. Eli looked at him carefully. She doesn't want anything to do with this, Eli said. She gave me the bus fare and told me to be back before dark. That's it. Why now? One of the older men asked from across the room. His name patch read Stitch. He was rail thin with long white hair and eyes that moved like he was always tracking something just off to the left. Why did she send you now, after 6 years? Eli reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded envelope. She didn't, he said. This did. He put the envelope on the table beside the jacket. It was ordinary, white, business-sized, handwritten address. But the handwriting was what mattered. Graves picked it up and studied it, and whatever he saw there did something to his face. That's Danny's handwriting, Decker said from the doorway. Flat, certain. It came 2 weeks ago, Eli said. Postmarked from Spokane. No return address. My aunt opened it, and then she locked herself in the bathroom for an hour, and when she came out, she told me to find a club called Iron Covenant MC. She said she'd kept this from me long enough, and that whatever happened next, she was sorry. Graves opened the envelope. Inside were 4 things: a handwritten note folded into quarters, a small photograph, a strip of paper with numbers and initials in a sequence that didn't immediately parse as anything recognizable, and a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be a road junction somewhere in the mountains with a circled point marked in red. The room went very quiet. Graves read the note once, then he read it again. Then he folded it carefully and held it in both hands, and didn't say anything for a full minute, during which time nobody else said anything either, and the snow outside hissed against the garage windows, and somewhere in the building something mechanical ticked in the cold. What does it say? Decker asked. Graves set the note down. His voice when he spoke was level, the specific levelness of a man who has excavated something from deep inside himself in order to function. It says Danny found something 6 years ago, something he couldn't prove without documentation. He went to get the documentation and someone found out and he had to run. A pause. He says he's been running ever since. He says the jacket has what we need to finish what he started. And he says... Graves stopped. What? Stitch said. He says Eli can't go home. The room shifted. Not physically, nobody moved, but the atmosphere in it changed, the way air changes before a storm when the pressure drops and the birds stop. What does that mean? Eli said. Graves looked at him with that same terrible stillness. It means whoever made your father run, he said carefully, knows you exist. It means whatever is hidden in that jacket is something people have been looking for a long time. And it means... He stopped again, and this time it wasn't for dramatic effect. He was choosing something, choosing carefully. It means you're not going back to Billings tonight. Eli stared at him. His heart was doing something fast and irregular that he was trying to control because he was 11 years old, and he was not going to fall apart in a room full of strangers, no matter what. Can I see the map? He asked, because it was the only thing he could think of to say that wasn't a question about his father. Graves slid it across the table. Eli looked at it. The junction was marked with landmarks, a broken water tower, a railroad crossing, a structure that might have been a building or might have been a ruin. In the margin, in the same handwriting as the note, were 4 words, still there, not burned. What's still there? Eli asked. Nobody answered right away. The men exchanged looks, not secretive looks, not conspiratorial, more like the looks of people who are calibrating how much weight can be placed on something before it breaks. 6 years ago, Graves said slowly, before we were told your father was dead, about 2 weeks before, he came to me. He said he'd found evidence of something that happened 12 years before that, something involving a facility in the mountains, federal storage, decommissioned. He said he'd found records proving that several men with money, men with influence, had used that facility to do something that cost 32 people their lives. Workers, civilian contractors. He said the disaster had been ruled an accident. But it wasn't an accident, Eli said. He believed it wasn't. He believed someone had engineered it deliberately, and he believed those same people had spent years destroying evidence and discrediting anyone who got close to the truth. Graves's jaw tightened. He said he'd found the original documentation, enough to reopen everything, enough to put people in prison. And then he disappeared, Eli said, 2 weeks later. The snow against the window, the tick of something cooling in the cold. Eli looked at the jacket on the table. He'd carried it for 200 miles on a Greyhound bus. He'd held it in his lap like it was something alive, something that needed to be kept warm. He'd fallen asleep with it on the seat beside him, one hand on the collar, and dreamed nothing at all. "There's something inside it," he said. Not a question. He'd known. He'd known since his aunt pressed it into his arms with shaking hands. "Probably," Graves said. "Should we—" "Not yet." Graves looked at the window. His eyes had gone to that distant assessment mode again, the perimeter sweep that was automatic as breathing. "Not here." He turned to the room. "Decker, how many people knew we were doing the memorial ride out of Rourke's today?" Decker thought about it. "It's in the regional newsletter. Chapter heads. Affiliated clubs in the area." "How affiliated?" "Varies." Graves nodded slowly. The particular nod of a man arriving at a conclusion he doesn't like. "Stitch," he said. "Are we being watched right now?" Stitch had moved to the small high window near the garage bay door. He stood to one side of it in the practiced way of someone who had learned a long time ago not to present as a silhouette. He looked out for a moment. "Blue pickup," he said. "Been in the lot across the highway since before the boy arrived. Engine's running, hasn't moved." Eli turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He thought about the bus, about the rest stop in Roundup where he'd gotten off to use the bathroom, and the man in the gray jacket who'd been standing near the phones, not using them, just standing, just watching the parking lot with that particular category of stillness that Eli was only now, in this room, beginning to understand meant something specific. "There was a man," he said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. "On the bus. At the rest stop." Every head in the room turned toward him. "Gray jacket," he said. "He was just standing there, but he looked at my backpack." Graves looked at him for a long, measuring moment. "At the backpack," he said, "or at what was on top of the backpack." Eli remembered. The jacket had been folded across his lap and he'd set it on top of the backpack when he got off to stretch. Because it was heavy and his arms were tired, and the man in the gray jacket had been— "At the jacket," Eli said quietly. Outside, the blue pickup's engine was still running. Graves straightened to his full height. Something had changed in the room. Not dramatic, not loud, but definite. A temperature shift. The men in the room were no longer simply standing. They were positioned. The difference was subtle and absolute. "How many bikes can we get running in 4 minutes?" Graves said. "All of them," Decker said. "Get them running." He looked at Eli. "Stay close to me. Don't touch the jacket yet. And whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, he stopped. "What?" Eli said. "Don't run," Graves said. "If something happens, don't run alone, you understand?" Eli didn't understand. Not fully. I was 11 years old and he was standing in a garage in Montana with a jacket full of secrets and a blue pickup truck idling across the highway, and a father who had been erased from the world to keep those secrets buried. But he nodded. And Graves turned toward the door. And outside, in the snow, the blue pickup slowly began to move. The blue pickup didn't accelerate. That was the first thing Graves clocked. Not a pursuit, not a ram, not the kind of move you make when you want to take something by force. It rolled, deliberate, patient. The way a man walks when he wants you to see him coming and wants you to know that seeing him coming doesn't change anything. It crossed the highway at about 15 miles an hour and pulled into the far edge of Rourke's lot and stopped. Nobody got out. Graves stood in the garage bay doorway with one hand braced on the frame and watched it. Behind him he could hear the other men moving, not scrambling, not panicking, the specific economy of people who had rehearsed bad situations enough times that the rehearsal had become muscle memory. Engines turning over, boots on concrete, the metallic whisper of something being checked and rechecked. "One occupant," Stitch said from behind his shoulder. "Can't make the face from here." "Don't need to," Graves said. "How do you know?" "Because if there was more than one, they wouldn't be sitting still." Eli stood 6 feet behind Graves with the jacket folded over his arms again. He'd picked it up off the table without thinking, the way you reach for something familiar when the world shifts under you. His heart was a fist knocking against the inside of his ribs. He was watching Graves' back, the set of his shoulders. The way the man's stillness was not the stillness of someone who didn't know what to do, but the stillness of someone who was deciding between options and taking his time with the decision, because rushing it would cost more than waiting. 2 minutes passed. 3. The snow was heavier now, the flakes larger, settling on the truck's hood, and the bikes in the lot and the gravel between them. Then the pickup's window rolled down. An arm came out. Just an arm, extended, palm open and facing outward. The old sign. The universal sign. The one that predated language. I am not holding a weapon. I am not reaching for one. I am showing you my empty hand. Graves exhaled through his nose. Decker, he said without turning around. Yeah. Go find out what he wants. A pause behind him. You sure? He drove all the way out here to park and wait and show us his palm. Man wants to talk. Let him talk. Decker went. Graves watched from the doorway, tracking Decker's path across the lot, tracking the arm in the truck window, tracking everything in between. Eli watched Graves. He was learning something about the man in these minutes, something that didn't have a clean label. The way attention worked in him, the way he distributed it, the way he could hold a dozen variables in his field of awareness simultaneously without seeming to strain at it. It was the kind of thing you got from years of being in situations where missing one variable had consequences. It took about 4 minutes. Decker walked to the truck, stood at the window for 2 of them, walked back. Claims he's a journalist, Decker said. Independent. Says he's been working the Black Ridge angle for 3 years. Says he knows what was in that facility. He glanced at Eli and then back at Graves. Says he got a tip that a boy with Danny Mercer's jacket would be here today. The name hit the room like a stone hitting still water. Who tipped him? Graves said. He won't say. Of course he won't. Graves finally stepped back from the doorway. He turned and looked at Eli, and then at the jacket in Eli's arms, and then at the men in the room, at their faces, reading something in each of them that Eli wasn't fluent enough yet to read himself. Put him in the diner. Tell him we'll come to him. Don't tell him anything else. And if he pushes? Tell him I said be patient. Decker went back out. Graves turned fully around in the room, which had been holding a collective breath, began, very slowly, to exhale. Stitch crossed to the table and picked up the folded note from the envelope Eli had brought. He held it without opening it, which was its own kind of statement. We have a problem, he said. We have several, Graves said. I mean, a specific one. Stitch set the note back down. If a journalist has been working this for 3 years and he knew to be here today, then whoever tipped him has been watching the Mercer situation for at least that long, which means the people who want the jacket buried have also been watching, Graves said. Yes, I worked that out. So the journalist in the diner is the least of our problems. Correct. Graves. An older man, heavy-set, with a white beard and hands like work gloves, his name, patch-reading Cork, spoke from the back of the room. His voice had a particular quality, the kind that didn't raise itself and didn't need to. I need to say something. Say it. We've been told this boy's father was dead for 6 years. 6 years. We grieved him. We put his name on the wall. He gestured, not toward the photograph wall, toward a smaller board near the back, handwritten names in black paint, Iron Covenant's private memorial. And now this boy walks in here with a jacket and a letter and a story, and a truck full of problems follows him directly to our door. A pause. I want to know how sure we are. The room went quiet in a new way, a harder way. Graves looked at Cork for a long moment. The patch on that collar is legitimate. Nobody outside this club, and the 3 men who designed it knows that patch exists. I know that. Then what exactly are you asking? Cork's jaw worked. I'm asking if we're sure the boy wasn't sent here. I'm asking if we're sure whoever wants that jacket buried didn't put him on that bus. Eli heard it land, felt it land. The words did something to his chest that was not quite like anything he'd felt before. Not the grief, not the fear, not the years of slow waiting in his aunt's house with the shoebox of photographs and the silence where a father should have been. This was different. This was being looked at like a question mark, like a tool, like something that might have been manufactured. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Cork and let the man see his face. Graves looked at Eli too. For a long moment, that had a lot of weight in it. He's 11 years old, Graves said finally. That's not an answer. The handwriting on that letter is Danny's. I've known that man's handwriting since 1994. The patch on that collar is real. And this boy took a Greyhound bus from Billings alone and stood in the snow for 40 minutes because nobody would talk to him. His voice didn't rise. It went the opposite direction, very level, very measured, the kind of level that was harder to argue with than anger. So I'm going to ask you to think carefully about what exactly you're implying before you finish implying it. Cork held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked away. Not submission, recalculation. The look of a man who still has doubts but has decided that this particular moment isn't the right moment to press them. Eli breathed. I want to open the jacket, Graves said. Now, here, all of us together. He looked at Eli. It's yours. Your call. Eli set it on the table. He'd been carrying it for 2 weeks since the envelope arrived. He'd slept with it in the room with him, which was something he hadn't told his aunt because she already looked at it like it was something radioactive. He'd unfolded it twice in private just to look at the collar patch, to run his thumb across the stitching and try to feel something that connected him to the man who had worn it. He hadn't looked inside. He'd known something was there. The weight was wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, something in the lining that distributed differently than leather and padding should, but he'd made a decision on the bus, somewhere outside Roundup with the snow coming down outside the window, that he wouldn't look until he found the right people. He believed, watching Graves' hands move carefully across the lining seams, that he had found them. The jacket was a classic cut. No brand mark, the label long since removed. The outer leather was a dark chocolate brown worn nearly black at the shoulders and cuffs. The lining was a deep burgundy nylon, and in 3 places the stitching along the lining seams had been redone. Subtle, close to matching, but not quite. The kind of repair work done by someone who needed the original seam to come apart and come together cleanly more than once. Graves found the first seam at the base of the left panel. He worked it open with his thumbnail and a thin blade from his jacket pocket. Slow, careful, the way a man opens something he might need to close again. The stitching gave without tearing. Inside the panel, folded flat against the leather body armor insert, was a photograph. He set it on the table. 8 by 10, printed on standard paper, creased with age but intact. It showed a facility, some kind of large industrial structure set into a hillside, surrounded by chain-link fence, 3 vehicles parked near a loading dock, and 6 men standing in loose formation near the dock's edge. The resolution was high enough that faces were readable, if you knew what you were looking for. Stitch leaned over the photograph. His face went through several things in quick succession. I know this building, he said. So do I, Graves said. That's the Alderman site. Stitch tapped the edge of the photograph without touching the image. The federal storage facility off Route 9. They shut it down in 2001 after the collapse. The accident, Cork said. His voice had changed. The skepticism was still there, but it had a different quality now, like a wall with a crack in it. Graves was looking at the faces in the photograph. The man on the far right, he said. Anyone? A long pause. Decker had come back in at some point. Eli hadn't heard him return. He was standing near the door with his arms crossed and his eyes on the photograph. That's Gerald Merritt, he said quietly. Or it was. Before he became Merritt Holdings. Before he bought the county commissioner's office and 3/4 of the county's development contracts. Gerald Merritt, Graves repeated, as if tasting the name. Who is now the most powerful private landowner in this county. Who donated the new sheriff's substation, Stitch said, 2 years ago. Another silence. A different kind. Eli looked at the faces in the photograph and tried to find his father there, but none of them were his father. His father had taken the photograph. His father had been standing where the camera was. There's more, Graves said. He moved to the second seam. The second concealed panel held a folded piece of paper, not the coordinates and initials stripped from the envelope, something denser. He unfolded it carefully. It was a photocopied document, government format, partially redacted with thick black bars but with enough visible text to establish its origin. A decommissioned federal contractor safety report, dated 14 months before the collapse at the Alderman facility. Along the margins, in his father's handwriting, were annotations, dates, names, numbers that connected the redacted sections to the names in the photograph and to events that Eli didn't have the context to understand yet, but that the men around him clearly did, reading in silence, their faces doing things they were trying to control. Cork picked it up. He read for a long time. When he set it back down, the wall in his face had a lot more cracks in it. He found the original safety reports, Cork said, the ones that were supposed to have been destroyed. He found copies, Graves said, and he spent years annotating them. Years. He was quiet for a moment. He didn't disappear because he ran. He disappeared because he was still working. Where's the third seam? Decker said. Graves turned the jacket over. The back panel, the armored insert at the spine, the heaviest section. He worked at the bottom edge carefully. The stitching was tighter here, the thread newer, replaced most recently. He got the edge open about 4 inches and stopped. He reached 2 fingers in. He pulled out a small card, a memory card, the kind used in cameras, sealed in a waterproof casing about the size of a matchbox. It had a strip of electrical tape across one face, and on the tape, in his father's handwriting, 4 words. Graves held it up so the room could see it. He read the 4 words aloud, his voice very quiet. For Graves, play first. The room held itself in complete stillness for 3 full seconds. Then every phone in the building buzzed simultaneously. Not a coincidence, not a group text, a specific, deliberate cascade. The kind that happened when someone pushed a trigger on a circuit that had been waiting. Graves checked his screen. Decker checked his. Stitch pulled his out and looked at it, and his expression went to something flat and hard. It's the chapter group line, Stitch said. Someone in the network sent a broadcast. What does it say? Graves asked. Stitch read it once. Then he looked up. It says, Iron Covenant, Black Ridge Chapter, is harboring a federal material witness without authorization. It says the club's non-interference agreement with local law enforcement is suspended pending investigation. It says, he stopped. What? Cork said. It says any member who maintains contact with the Mercer family will be considered in violation of club charter and subject to removal. He put his phone in his pocket. It's signed with a sergeant-at-arms code from the regional chapter head. Dead silence. Eli didn't fully understand the architecture of what had just happened, but he understood the faces around him, understood that something had been activated, something that had reached inside the club itself, something positioned and waiting and triggered at exactly the moment the jacket was opened. Someone inside the network had been watching. That code is legitimate, Graves said. It's a legitimate code, Stitch said. Whether it came from who it says it came from is a different question. Who has access to the regional SAA codes? Decker asked. Chapter officers. Regional officers. Anyone who's had access to the communications directory in the last 5 years. Stitch paused. And anyone who managed to get into the directory from outside. Graves stood very still with the memory card in his hand. Eli watched him and understood, in the way that children understand things that adults think are too complex for them, that the man was carrying something that had just gotten considerably heavier. The club's network, the system that connected dozens of chapters, that had protocols and hierarchies, and the particular glue of loyalty that held complicated human structures together, had just been used as a weapon against them. From inside or outside, it didn't matter yet. What mattered was that it had happened within minutes of the jacket being opened, within minutes of the memory card being found, which meant someone had been watching Rourke's garage, had been watching it closely enough and with enough inside information to know the moment the jacket's contents were revealed. There's a camera somewhere, Graves said. Not a question. Has to be, Decker said. He was already moving, scanning the walls, the rafters, the high corners of the room, where a lens the size of a thumbnail could sit invisible for months. Stitch, Graves said, the journalist. Is he still in the diner? Stitch checked the window. Truck's still there. He didn't send that broadcast. No, he's been sitting in a diner for 20 minutes. Then he's either not connected to the people who did, Graves said, or he's connected to them in a way that means they're keeping him visible on purpose. Why would they do that? To give us something to focus on while they moved. Decker found it 6 minutes later. Small, wireless, magnetized to the back of a junction box near the ceiling of the garage bay, angled to cover the entrance to the clubhouse room. Not sophisticated. Not the work of professionals, or at least not the kind of professionals who expected to be caught before they got what they needed. The kind of work that assumed the people being watched wouldn't be looking for it. They had underestimated the room. Graves held the camera in his palm and looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Cork. Still think the boy was sent here? He said quietly. Cork said nothing, which was an answer. Here's what we know, Graves said, setting the camera on the table beside the photograph and the document and the memory card. Somebody has been watching this situation for at least as long as the journalist has been working it. Probably longer. They knew about the jacket. They knew about the boy. They have someone, inside this network or with access to it, who can send authenticated broadcasts on our internal lines, and they move the moment we open the jacket. He looked around the room. Which means whatever is on this card, they cannot afford for us to play it. So we play it, Decker said. We play it, Graves said, but not here. Where? Graves looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him and waited because there was nothing else to do, because the bus back to Billings had already been overtaken by events that didn't care about bus schedules or ants or promises to be home before dark. Eli, Graves said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Okay? In the last 2 weeks since the envelope arrived, has anyone come to your aunt's house? Visited, called, knocked on the door? Anyone unfamiliar? Eli thought. He thought about the car that had been parked outside the house for 3 days last week. A silver sedan, different plates each day, which he'd noticed because he'd been watching the street the way his father's letter had made him start watching things. He thought about the phone call his aunt had taken at 11 at night, 2 nights before she sent him here, that had made her sit at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee and an expression like someone who has just been told the geography of a nightmare. He told Graves about both. Graves listened without interrupting. When Eli finished, he turned to the room. We need to move, now, not in an hour. He picked up the memory card. And we need to reach your aunt, right now before... His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face, that careful, controlled stillness, developed a fault line. He answered it, put it on speaker. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a woman's voice, thin and frightened and trying not to sound either. Is the boy there? Is Eli? He's here, Graves said. Are you safe? There are 2 men outside. They've been there since this morning. A sound in the background, something falling. They just came to the door. Don't open it, Graves said. They said they're from the county health office. They said it's about the house. Don't open the door, Graves said again. Listen to me. Lock yourself in the bathroom. Take your phone. Don't open anything. He was already moving toward the garage bay, signaling to Decker with his free hand. I'm going to give you a number. You're going to call it. The man who answers is named Reyes, and you're going to tell him Iron Covenant, code 7. Can you remember that? Iron Covenant, code 7, she repeated. Don't open the door. He ended the call and the room moved. Not chaos, not panic, the opposite. The specific coordinated motion of a unit that had drilled for the moment when things stopped being theoretical. Cork, who had doubted everything 20 minutes ago, was already on his way to his bike. Stitch had the photograph and the document. Decker had the jacket. And Graves had the memory card in his fist and was looking at Eli with an expression that had shed everything extraneous. All the calculation, all the management, all the careful architecture of a man who spent years maintaining distance from things that could damage him. What was underneath was something raw, something that recognized, in the frightened 11-year-old in front of him, a version of a weight he'd been carrying for 6 years. You trust me? He said. It was not a rhetorical question. He meant it as a real question, a genuine one, and he waited for a real answer. Eli thought about the bus, about the rest stop and the man in the gray jacket, about his aunt's face at 2 in the morning with the cold coffee, about the name on the wall in the back of this room, his father's name in black paint, the club's private memorial, about a jacket that had been carried for 6 years through whatever his father had survived, addressed to a specific person, held until the right moment by a woman who didn't want anything to do with any of it, but who had, in the end, sent her nephew toward the only people who might actually know what to do. Yes, Eli said. Then stay close, Graves said, and don't let go of that jacket. They came out of the garage into the snow and the cold and the sound of engines turning over, big engines, Harley engines, the sound that sits in the chest rather than the ears, low and deliberate and unapologetic about the space it occupies in the world. 8 motorcycles, 9. The riders mounting with the ease of people who had done this 10,000 times, the lot filling with exhaust and the specific quality of attention that comes over a group of people who have committed to a course of action and are done deliberating. Eli climbed behind Graves on the lead bike. He'd never been on a motorcycle. He didn't say this. He put his arms around the man's waist, which felt strange, felt enormous, felt like holding on to something geological. And he held the jacket against his chest with both forearms, and he felt the engine come up through the seat and into his bones. The blue pickup was still in the lot across the highway. As the column of motorcycles began to move, its engine turned over. It pulled out behind them. Not rushing, not closing, following the same way it had approached. Patient, deliberate, the way something follows when it knows where you're going has limited exits. Graves felt the pickup behind them through some instinct that Eli couldn't identify. He didn't turn to look. He just opened the throttle, smooth and decisive, and the column accelerated onto the highway, and the town of Black Ridge fell away behind them into the snow. "Where are we going?" Eli said, leaning close enough to be heard over the wind. "Somewhere they haven't had time to set up," Graves said. And after that? The highway stretched ahead of them, 2 lanes cut through white, the mountains closing in on both sides in the gray afternoon light. Graves didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had something in it that Eli would spend a long time afterward trying to classify. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it, the early chemistry of a thing still deciding what it would become. "After that," Graves said, "we play that card." And the column rode north into the gray, and the pickup followed. And somewhere behind them in a diner, a journalist sat with a cold cup of coffee and a story he couldn't yet prove. And somewhere in Billings, a woman sat in a locked bathroom calling a number she'd never called before. And somewhere in the mountains ahead of them was a decommissioned facility and a truth that had cost 32 lives to bury and 6 more years to carry. And a dead man's final recorded voice waiting on a card the size of a matchbox, addressed to a man who had spent 6 years believing his brother was gone, and a boy who had never stopped believing his father might not be. The snow closed in behind them like a curtain, and the road ahead bent around the mountain and disappeared. They rode for 40 minutes before Graves pulled off the highway. Not a town, not a gas station, a logging road that cut north into the tree line, unmarked, the kind of road that doesn't appear on digital maps because it predates digital maps by several decades and nobody has bothered to add it. The column followed him in without question, 8 bikes threading single file between the pines, the snow muffling the engine sound the moment the trees closed overhead. That particular acoustic shift from highway noise to something smaller and more enclosed, more intimate, the way a whisper sounds different in a cathedral than on a street. The blue pickup did not follow them off the highway. Eli felt Graves register this, a slight adjustment in the set of his shoulders, not relaxation, something more provisional than that. An acknowledgement that the immediate variable had changed, which was not the same thing as the situation improving. The road ended at a clearing. At the center of the clearing sat a structure, a timber frame building, large enough to hold 10 vehicles, the kind of thing that gets built for one purpose and then repurposed so many times it stops having a clear identity. The windows were boarded, a padlock on the main door, and on the post beside the door, a marker, small, painted, a symbol that Eli didn't recognize but that Graves clearly did, because he drove straight to it without hesitation. He had a key. Inside was cold and dim, the kind of cold that has been accumulating for months, the kind of dim that comes from no windows and no power, and the specific neutrality of a space that has been waiting rather than abandoned. There was a generator in the corner and a folding table and 6 metal chairs, and someone had been here recently enough that a case of water bottles and 2 sleeping bags sat near the back wall in a tarp-wrapped bundle. "Safe house?" Decker said. "Layover point," Graves said. "Nobody knows about this one except the chapter heads who helped build it, which narrows our problem considerably." He looked at the memory card in his hand. "Does anyone have a reader?" Stitch produced a small device from his saddlebag, an older card reader, the kind that connected to a laptop. He also produced the laptop. The reader connected. The card slid in. The men gathered around the table. Eli stood at Graves' elbow, close enough to see the screen, and nobody told him to step back. The card held 3 files. 2 were document scans, dense, multi-page, the kind of bureaucratic architecture that accumulates around institutional failure like scar tissue. The third was a video file. Its file name was a date followed by a single initial, G. Graves stared at it for a moment. Then he clicked it. The video was shot on a phone, the frame slightly tilted, the lighting poor. A bare bulb somewhere above and to the left, shadows heavy on the right side. The background was a concrete wall, water-stained, no identifying marks. The man in the frame was sitting with his back to the wall, And even accounting for the years, even accounting for the weight he'd lost, and the beard he'd grown, and the fatigue that had settled into his face like sediment at the bottom of a river, Eli knew him. He knew the jaw. He knew the way the shoulders held slightly forward, braced. He knew his father. Nobody spoke. Danny Mercer looked directly into the camera. He was maybe 40. He looked 60. He had a cut on his temple, healed but recent enough to still be red, and his hands in his lap were wrapped in cloth bandaging. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who had rehearsed this many times and was now doing it for what he believed might be the last time. "Graves," he said, "if you're watching this, then Eli found you, which means either things went better than I planned, or they went exactly as bad as I was afraid they would, and my boy is sitting right there next to you." A pause. Graves said nothing. Eli said nothing. The fire in the generator-powered space heater that Stitch had gotten running clicked and breathed. "I need you to understand something before I tell you what's in those documents," Danny said. "What happened at the Alderman facility in 2001? The collapse, the 32 workers. That was not an accident. You already know that. I told you as much before I ran, and you had no reason to believe me then, without the proof. But here's what I didn't tell you then. What I couldn't tell you." He stopped, looked at something just off frame. When he looked back, his jaw was set in the way of a man who is going to say something that costs him. The collapse was engineered, deliberately, by men who needed the facility sealed permanently, and who needed the workers who had seen what was inside it to be permanently unavailable to testify about what they'd seen. Decker shifted behind Eli. Cork's breathing was audible. "What was inside it," Danny continued, "was a cache of documents. Federal contracts, financial records, communications between 7 individuals, private citizens, all of them with significant capital, and 3 government-level officials whose names are in the file. These documents proved that those 7 individuals had been awarded federal infrastructure contracts through a process that involved sustained fraud, bribery, and the deliberate falsification of environmental impact reports across 14 project sites in 4 states. The Alderman facility was used as a distribution hub. The workers knew because they processed the shipments. When the contracts were due to be audited in 2001, the facility was sealed, with the workers inside." The space heater clicked. 32 people, Danny said, sealed alive inside a federal facility so that 7 men could protect contracts worth approximately $400 million. He looked directly into the camera again. Gerald Merritt was the operational coordinator, the man who arranged the sealing, the man who wrote the work order that was later filed as an emergency structural assessment and buried in a county records archive. His name is on everything, and the documents proving it are on this card. Another pause. Longer this time. "Now," Danny said, "here is the part I need you to hear, the reason I ran, the reason I couldn't come back." He pressed his lips together. "When I found the documents, I went to someone I trusted inside the federal system. Someone I believed was clean. I gave him copies. I told him where the originals were. And 2 weeks later, 2 weeks, Graves, the man I trusted told me there was a federal warrant for my arrest. Not for what I'd found, for what I'd allegedly done. They built a case. Financial fraud. 20 counts. All fabricated, all documented, all airtight from the outside." He said it flatly, without performance, which made it worse. "I was not running from Merritt. I was running from a compromised federal system that Merritt had spent 20 years building into something that would protect him." Graves's hand was flat on the table. Very flat, the knuckles just barely showing white. "The man inside the federal system," Danny said. "The man I trusted." A pause that pulled the air out of the room. "His name is Warren Lowell. He goes by his middle name now. He goes by Dale. He's been operating as an independent security contractor for the past several years." Another pause. "He is also, as of approximately 18 months ago, the regional sergeant-at-arms liaison for the Iron Covenant Network." The silence that followed was a different animal from all the previous silences in this building. It had mass. It had texture. It occupied the room the way water occupies a glass, completely, with nowhere left for air. Graves did not move. Eli felt the stillness come off him like temperature, like something being held at absolute zero. It was Stitch who broke first. Not loudly, not dramatically, a single low sound that was not a word and not quite a curse, Just a phoneme of pure shock escaping from somewhere involuntary. Terry. Dale Lowell, Decker said. Not a question. Flat. The broadcast. The broadcast, Graves said. He sent it. Yes. He's been inside the network for 18 months, Danny says. Probably longer. Graves straightened. His voice had that controlled levelness again, but underneath it now was something that Eli had not heard there before. Something that the control was actively working against. Which means he's had 18 months of access to our communications, our safe house locations, our chapter directories, He stopped, looked at the laptop screen. Danny's image was paused on the last frame, his eyes looking directly into the camera, directly at whoever was watching. He knew the boy was coming before we did. How? Cork said. Because he's been watching the Mercer situation since Danny disappeared, since he sold Danny to Merritt in the first place. Graves turned away from the table. He walked to the back wall of the building and stood there with his back to the room for about 15 seconds. Nobody said anything during those 15 seconds. He knew the jacket existed because Danny told him about it when he went to him for help. He spent 6 years trying to find it before we did. Eli stood at the table with his father's face frozen on the screen and understood, with the clarity that comes to children in the moments when adults forget to maintain the comfortable fictions, what this meant. Not in full, not the political architecture of it, not the legal implications of 18 months of network compromise, not the specific danger profile of a man who had spent 6 years inside both a federal system and a motorcycle club network simultaneously, but the core of it, the human core. His father had gone to someone for help, and that someone had sold him, had watched 32 people already dead, had known exactly what Danny Mercer had found and exactly what it meant, and had made a decision. Had taken the money or the position or whatever currency a man like Warrendale Lowell traded in and had pointed the mechanism at the person who had trusted him. And Danny Mercer had spent 6 years running, alone, without being able to come home, without being able to come back to his club, without being able to come back to the son he'd left with an aunt and an address and a jacket full of evidence, because the system he'd tried to use to expose the truth had been the thing hunting him. He knew he'd play the card, Eli said. Everyone looked at him. He sent the broadcast to isolate you from the network, Eli said, so you couldn't get backup. And he put that camera in the garage so he'd know the exact moment you found it. He's been waiting for you to find it so he'd know where the card was, so he could come get it. He looked at Graves. He's not following us. He doesn't need to follow us. He knows where you go when things go bad. He's been inside your safe house list for 18 months. The room processed this. And then, from outside, distant but approaching, came the sound of engines. Not Harleys. Something lighter. Multiple vehicles, moving fast on the logging road. Graves turned from the wall. How many safe houses are on the network directory? He said, already moving. 11 in the region, Stitch said, on his feet, closing the laptop. He won't hit all of them simultaneously. He doesn't have the manpower for that without drawing attention. He'll start with the most logical one. Graves was at the door, one hand on the frame, looking back at the room. Which means we have maybe 3 minutes before whoever is on that road reaches the clearing. We run, Decker said. We can't run. There's one road out and they're on it. Graves looked at the room, at the layout of it, the exits, the windows, the generator, the space heater. His eyes moved with that perimeter quality, cataloging, assessing. We go dark. Generator off. Bikes out the back through the service door. Nobody moves until I say. The generator cut. The space heater died. The room went immediately cold and immediately dark. The kind of dark that is not quite total. There was residual light from the snow outside, finding its way through the door cracks and the boarded windows. Enough to see shapes, enough to see hands. The bikes went out the back in near silence, pushed rather than ridden, boots quiet on the dirt floor. Eli helped push Graves' bike, both hands on the rear frame, and felt the cold of the metal through his palms, and thought about nothing except keeping his feet quiet and his breathing controlled. The sound of the approaching engines got louder. Stopped. Silence outside. Then footsteps. More than one person, moving around the perimeter of the building. Professional footsteps, spaced, deliberate, the kind that indicate people who have been trained to clear a structure. Not Merritt's men, not the kind of resource a county-level businessman keeps on call. Something more expensive. Something that had been arranged well in advance of tonight. Eli pressed himself against the interior wall beside Graves and held still. A light swept across the crack under the door. A flashlight, high-powered, the beam white and surgical. A voice outside, low. 2 words, north side. Another voice responding, further away, wordless. Just an affirmative sound, the kind of shorthand used by people who communicate in abbreviation. Graves' hand found Eli's shoulder in the dark. Not a grip. A placement. Steady. The way you anchor something that is in danger of moving. Eli breathed through his nose, counted the sounds. 4 sets of footsteps minimum, probably 6. 2 had gone to the north side. 2 were at the front. 2 unaccounted for. The front door lock rattled. It held. The padlock was substantial, the kind of hardware that takes tools or time, and these men had not brought the right tools for quiet work on a padlock in the dark. There was a murmured consultation outside. Decision being made. Back door, Graves said, directly into Eli's ear. Below breath. Below everything. They moved. All of them, in the dark, in the specific coordinated way of a group that has spent enough time together that communication has become almost nonverbal. Eli moved with them, keeping his hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him, feeling the shoulder of the man behind him keeping contact. Human chain. The motorcycles were already outside. The service door at the rear of the building was open, the cold coming through it in a clean band. They were through it and into the tree line before the front door gave. The sound it made when it finally went, not subtle, not surgical, a pry bar applied with force, was loud enough to cover the sound of 8 men and a boy moving through snow-crusted undergrowth in the dark. And it was loud enough that the men who had gone to the north side would be moving toward the sound of their colleagues, away from the rear. They rode without headlights for a half-mile, following the logging road by the pale geometry of snow on either side. Eli's face against Graves' back and his hands locked together at the man's waist, and his heart doing something that he had no frame of reference for. Not fear exactly, something that had moved past fear into a territory that didn't have a clear label, the place you get to when fear has been running so long it starts to transform into something more functional. When they hit the highway, Graves lit the headlight and accelerated. "Where are we going?" Decker called over the wind, pulling alongside. "Elk Pass," Graves said. "The one off the county records, not the network list." Decker nodded and fell back. They rode for 20 minutes in the snow and the dark with the highway empty on both sides and the mountains sitting black and enormous against the slightly lighter sky. Eli watched the road over Graves' shoulder and thought about his father's face on the screen, about the way Danny had looked into the camera, directly, without self-pity, with the particular clarity of a man who has lived a long time with a truth that nobody else knew and has learned to carry it without letting it crush him. If you're watching this, then Eli found you. He'd planned for this. Not hoped for it, planned for it. He'd known that if the jacket survived long enough and Eli was old enough and the circumstances aligned, this exact sequence would happen. He'd planned it with the precision of a man who had very little left to trust except his own preparation, which meant he'd also planned for what came next. Graves pulled off the highway onto a gravel track that cut between 2 granite outcroppings, invisible from the road unless you knew the exact angle. The column followed. The track wound for about a quarter mile and opened into a small clearing with a concrete block structure. A hunting camp, off-grid, the kind of thing that appears on county property records as an agricultural outbuilding and in practice functions as whatever its owner needs it to be. There was a padlock on this door too. Graves had a key for this one as well. Inside, he got a battery lantern going. The light was warm and low and cast everything in amber, and in that light the men looked older than they had in the fluorescent harshness of Rourke's garage. Older, and more tired, and more real. Nobody spoke for a minute. They moved through the small space, securing it, checking it, the habits of men who don't sit down in an unknown room until they've verified it. Then Graves set the laptop on a crate in the corner and opened the card reader and put the card back in. "There's more on it," he said. "Danny wouldn't have stopped at the video." He was right. There were the 2 document files, each extensive, each dense, each representing years of careful, meticulous work by a man operating alone and without resources, building a case from whatever he could reach in the scattered architecture of a covered-up institutional crime. But there was also a second video file. No file name, no date, Just a file with a size that suggested it was shorter than the first, maybe 3 minutes. Graves looked at it for a moment. He clicked it. Same concrete wall, same bare bulb. But this time Danny was standing, not sitting, and the camera was propped on something rather than held, the frame slightly lower. He looked different from the first video. Not better, but more resolved. The difference between a man who is preparing and a man who has prepared. The first message was for you, Graves, Danny said. This one is for both of you. He looked directly into the lens. Eli, if you're watching this, then you did exactly what I asked. You found them. You gave them the jacket. A pause. His jaw worked. I know you have about 1,000 questions, and I know I don't get to answer them the way a father is supposed to. In person. Over time. The way it's supposed to work. He stopped. Started again. I'm going to ask you to do something hard. I'm going to ask you to trust Graves the way you would have trusted me. Not because he's me. He's not. He's a better man than I am in some ways and a worse one in others, and he would tell you the same thing. A complicated expression crossed his face. But he is the only person in the world I would trust with what I couldn't give you myself. Eli was aware, in some peripheral part of his consciousness, that his face was doing things he wasn't controlling. He was aware that the men in the room were looking away, at the floor, at the walls, anywhere except at the boy with the lantern light on his face and his father's voice coming out of a laptop speaker in a concrete room in the Montana mountains. He didn't look away from the screen. There's one more thing, Danny said. His voice changed register, still controlled, but the control was working harder now. In the documents, the second file, page 47, there's a name. Not Merritt, not Lowell. A third name. Someone I didn't know about until 8 months ago when I found the financial routing records. He looked directly into the camera. It's someone you know, Graves. Someone who has been very close to this chapter for a long time. Another pause. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I can't tell you who it is in a way that's easier to hear, but it's in the documents, and when you see it... He stopped. When you see it, remember that I didn't want to be right about this. The video ended. The lantern burned. Outside, snow on the roof, quiet and steady. Graves opened the second document file. He scrolled to page 47. The page was a financial routing record, columns of numbers, account identifiers, transfer references, the kind of document that is simultaneously dense and transparent once you know what you're looking at. He found the name in the third column of a transfer table, associated with an account that had received disbursements from a Merritt Holdings subsidiary for a period of approximately 4 years. He read it once. He didn't say anything. He turned the laptop so the room could see the screen. Cork read it. His face went the color of ash. Decker read it. He made a sound and turned away and put both hands on the wall. Stitch read it and sat down on the floor, which was not something Stitch did, not something any of them had ever seen Stitch do. And the act of it communicated more than any expression could have. The name on the screen was Reyes, the same Reyes whose number Graves had given Eli's aunt, the same Reyes he'd designated as their emergency contact 45 minutes ago, the same Reyes who was, according to 4 years of financial records on a dead man's memory card, on Gerald Merritt's payroll. Graves' aunt was in a locked bathroom in Billings, waiting to call a number that led directly to the man who was trying to bury everything in this room. Graves was across the space in 3 steps, phone in hand, calling the number he'd given Eli's aunt, and the line rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and he called it again, and on the third attempt it rang twice and a man answered. Not Eli's aunt, a man, and said nothing. Just answered and waited. Reyes, Graves said. A pause. Then, it's been a long day, Gideon. Nobody in the room moved. Don't touch the woman, Graves said. His voice was very quiet and very precise, each word placed with the deliberateness of something that cannot afford to be misunderstood. She's fine, Reyes said. She'll stay fine. That's entirely up to you. What do you want? You know what I want. Graves looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him. In the amber lantern light, in the concrete room, in the sound of his father's voice still somehow present in the air, even though the video had ended, Eli held his ground and waited. The card, Graves said. The card, Reyes confirmed. Everything on it. The jacket, the photographs, the documents, all of it. You bring it to the Alderman Junction by 6 in the morning, and the woman goes home and the boy goes home, and Iron Covenant goes on existing as whatever it's been pretending to be for the last decade. And if I don't? Then tomorrow morning, Reyes said, with the specific flatness of a man reading from a script he wrote himself, a package of financial records arrives at the regional ATF office. Records showing that Iron Covenant, Black Ridge chapter, has been operating as a distribution network for stolen federal property for the past 8 years. All fabricated, all documented, all airtight from the outside. He paused. You've heard that phrase before, I think. He ended the call. Graves lowered the phone. The room was completely silent except for the snow and the lantern. And Eli understood in that moment that everything his father had survived, everything he'd sacrificed, the 6 years of running and hiding and building a case alone in rooms with concrete walls and bare bulbs, could be taken off the board by morning unless someone in this room was willing to become something they hadn't been before. He looked at Graves. Graves was already looking at him. He doesn't know what's on the card, Eli said. Not exactly. He knows it exists, he knows it has the documents, but he doesn't know about the video. He held Graves' gaze. He doesn't know my dad named him. The lantern flickered. Graves looked at the laptop screen, at the name in the third column of a financial transfer table, at 4 years of payments that represented the price of a man's conscience, and 32 lives and 6 years of a father's exile. He thinks he's buying silence, Eli said. He thinks if he gets the card, it's over. It won't be over, Graves said quietly. There are copies. Danny was meticulous. I know, Eli said, but Reyes doesn't know that. Something moved through the room then. Not a plan yet, not a strategy, something earlier than that, the moment before a plan when the shape of the possible becomes visible. Graves looked at Eli with that same quality of looking he'd had in the snow outside Rourke's garage, the thing that was not quite recognition, but was its closest relative. 6 in the morning, Graves said. At the Alderman Junction, Eli said. That's 4 hours. 4 hours, Eli agreed. Outside, the snow had stopped. The clouds were breaking, and through the gap a cold white light was filtering down. And in that light, the mountain and the trees and the road were very clear and very quiet. And the junction was 30 miles north, and 4 hours was not very long to build something capable of ending what should have ended 23 years ago when 32 people walked into a building and never walked out. Graves picked up the memory card from the table and held it in his closed fist for a moment. Then he opened the laptop again and started talking to his men, and his voice was very steady, and the plan it carried was the kind that does not allow for the luxury of fear. And in the corner of the room, Eli Mercer sat with his father's jacket across his knees and listened to every word. They had 4 hours and they used all of them. Graves didn't sleep. Nobody slept. The hunting camp became something else in those 4 hours. Not a command center, nothing that organized or that clean, but a space where men who had been carrying something heavy for a long time finally put it down on the table and looked at it directly and decided what they were willing to do about it. The plan was not complicated. Complicated plans failed in the field because they required too many variables to behave. This one had 3 moving parts and a contingency, and a piece of it that depended entirely on something Graves could not control, which was the one part he thought about the most in the 2 hours before they rode. Stitch drove out first, alone, at 3 in the morning, taking the long route north on back roads that added 40 minutes to the trip. He carried a burner phone and a copy of the documents, not the originals, a photograph of each page taken on Decker's phone and transferred to a cheap handset bought from a gas station 2 counties over 6 months ago for exactly this kind of situation. The kind of contingency that gets prepared when you live a life that accumulates enemies. He also carried the contact information for a journalist named Marcus Hale, who had been sitting in a diner in Black Ridge for several hours now, drinking cold coffee and waiting. Decker took Cork and 2 of the younger riders and went east on the highway, visible, headlights on, the kind of movement that would register on any surveillance covering the main approaches to the Alderman Junction. Not aggressive, just present. Men on bikes moving in the dark, which was not unusual enough to trigger action, but was unusual enough to be tracked, and being tracked was the point. Graves waited until 3:45. Then he looked at Eli and said, "You don't have to come." Eli was already on his feet. "Yes, I do. This isn't... He's my father's evidence. That's my aunt in Billings. And that man on the phone, Eli stopped. His voice had something in it that was not anger exactly, something harder than anger and more sustainable. He's the reason my dad couldn't come home. He's the reason I grew up in my aunt's house with a shoebox of photographs. He held Graves' gaze. I'm coming. Graves looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he picked up the jacket from the crate where it had been sitting and held it out. Eli put it on. It was enormous on him, the shoulders falling halfway to his elbows, the hem at his knees. But the weight of it settled differently than he'd expected. Not burdensome, grounding, the way weight sometimes is when it belongs to you. They rode south and then cut north on this county road, staying off the highway, the two of them and two others, men named Voss and Terrell, both quiet, both the kind of quiet that comes from having been in situations where noise was a liability. The cold was extreme now, the temperature having dropped through the floor in the hours after midnight, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in clothing and works its way inward methodically. Eli pressed himself against Graves' back and felt the engine heat coming up through the frame and focused on that. The Alderman Junction was marked on the county road map as a maintenance intersection, two roads crossing at the base of a mountain with a turnoff that led half a mile up the slope to the old facility site. The facility itself was invisible from the junction, screened by topography and 20 years of encroaching pine growth. What you could see from the junction was the junction, flat, open, exposed on 3 sides, a wide gravel clearing where the maintenance crews had once staged equipment. Exposed was the point. Reyes had chosen it for the same reason Graves had recognized it as a problem the moment he heard the name. No approach that couldn't be monitored, no cover for a large group. The kind of location that advantages the party with surveillance assets and disadvantages the party without them. Graves had spent 2 of the 4 hours working around that disadvantage. They stopped 200 yards from the junction, in the tree line. The bikes went quiet. In the sudden silence, Eli could hear his own heartbeat and the distant sound of the mountain and the specific quality of cold night stillness that has no bottom to it. 2 vehicles, Voss said, low, binoculars at his eyes. Parked at the north side of the clearing, I see 3 people at the vehicles. Might be more in the vehicles. Light? Graves said. They've got a portable flood, aimed at the access road. They'll see anyone coming from the south long before anyone arrives. Good, Graves said. Voss lowered the binoculars and looked at him. Good? That's where I want them looking. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text. 1 word, now. Half a mile to the east, on the ridgeline above the junction, Stitch received it. At 4:22 in the morning, Marcus Hale's phone rang. I was still in the diner. The owner had let him stay, had brought him a blanket and a fresh pot of coffee around midnight without being asked, with the specific hospitality of someone who understands that some kinds of waiting are serious. He answered on the first ring. Stitch's voice. You want the Black Ridge story? A pause. Who is this? Somebody who has 47 pages of financial records, 2 hours of video testimony, and a name you've been trying to find for 3 years. Another pause. You have a secure upload capacity? Yes. Give me the address. The documents began transferring at 4:26. At the junction, Reyes was a silhouette against the portable flood, standing at the center of the clearing with his hands in his jacket pockets. He was not a large man, medium height, medium build, the kind of physical presence that was easy to underestimate, and had learned to use that quality deliberately. Beside him stood 2 men who were not medium anything, both large, both positioned with the specific weight distribution of people who expected to be in physical confrontations and had prepared for this one specifically. Behind the vehicles, Eli counted 2 more, maybe 3. The vehicles themselves were dark SUVs, the kind that came with tinted glass and cargo space. There was a 5th person, sitting in the back of the closer SUV, visible as a shape through the glass. Small. Still. Eli's aunt. He felt Graves's hand on his arm. Not restraining, informational. I see her. I know. Graves walked into the floodlight alone. He walked the way he always walked. Not performing confidence, just moving through space as if the space belonged to him. As if the 2 large men between him and Reyes were a minor geographical feature. Notable, but not material. He stopped at the edge of the light. Reyes, he said. The man stepped forward. In the light, his face was readable for the first time. Not the voice on the phone, not the name on a financial record, but a face. Late 50s, maybe 60. Eyes that had the specific quality of someone who had spent decades being careful. Something in the set of his mouth that might have been regret in a different life, and in this one had calcified into something else. "You brought the boy," Reyes said. "He insisted." That was a mistake. Was it? Not a question. Reyes looked at Eli, at the jacket specifically, his eyes tracking down the oversized leather to the patch on the collar, and something in his expression shifting when he saw it. "Take the jacket off, son." Eli didn't move. "Take the jacket off," Reyes said again, quieter, which was worse than louder would have been. "And give me the card. And you and your aunt go home and none of this ever happened." "That's a good offer," Graves said. "For you." "It's the only offer." "Is it?" Graves tilted his head slightly. "Because I was thinking about something on the ride here, about how a man in your position, man who's spent 4 years on Merritt's payroll, 18 months inside our network, 6 years hunting a jacket, about how a man like that gets to a place where he thinks that offer is sufficient, that the story ends with a handoff in a clearing at 4 in the morning and everyone goes home." He paused. "And the only way I can figure a man believes that is if he thinks he still controls the information." Reyes was very still. "Does Merritt know you're here?" Graves said. A fractional pause, less than a second, but it was there. "Because I was looking at those financial records," Graves continued, "and the disbursements from Merritt Holdings to your account stopped 14 months ago, which is interesting, which suggests that either you parted ways professionally or the payments moved to a different routing." He let that sit for a moment. "Or that you've been running this extraction personally, not for Merritt, for yourself." You don't know what you're talking about," Reyes said. "I think I do. I think Merritt doesn't know about the card. I think he doesn't know about you being inside our network. I think you've been running a private operation for the past year trying to get ahead of this before it surfaced, because whatever arrangement you had with Merritt ended, and now you're exposed on both sides." Graves looked at him steadily. "You're not protecting Merritt, you're protecting yourself." The two large men shifted. Small movement, barely perceptible, but Eli caught it. A weight transfer, a readiness. Something had been said that changed the temperature. "Give me the card," Reyes said. His voice had shed whatever professional courtesy it had been carrying. What was underneath was flat and cold and very direct. "Give me the card and the jacket and walk away. Last time." "Can't do that," Graves said. "Then this gets harder." "It already got harder," Graves said, "about 40 minutes ago." His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't check it. He'd been expecting it, and he let it buzz and kept his eyes on Reyes and waited for the man to understand what the buzz meant. It took about 4 seconds. Reyes pulled out his own phone, looked at the screen, and something happened in his face. Not panic, something more interior than panic. The face of a man watching a structure he built over years collapse in a moment, which is a specific kind of devastation that doesn't look like the movies suggest it should. It looked quiet. It looked like something going out. "The documents have been uploaded," Graves said, "to a journalist named Marcus Hale, who's been working this story for 3 years and who, as of about 30 minutes ago, has enough verified material to publish. The video, the financial records, your name, Merritt's name, the Alderman facility, all 32 victims." He paused. "It's already gone, Reyes. Whatever you take from this clearing doesn't change what's already out there." Reyes lowered his phone. The clearing was very quiet. The floodlight hummed. The two large men were looking at Reyes for instruction, and Reyes was not giving any, and the absence of instruction in men like that creates its own kind of danger. The danger of people defaulting to the last directive when the current situation exceeds their parameters. The larger of the two men, the one on the left, with the particular build of someone who had been paid for physical outcomes long enough that it had become identity, reached under his jacket. Graves moved, not toward the man, sideways and down, the specific lateral drop of someone who has been trained to remove himself from a line of force rather than oppose it. He came back up with his forearm across the man's extended arm and his weight behind it, and the sound it made was not the sound of a fight in a movie, which is choreographed and rhythmic. It was the sound of physics, mass and velocity, and leverage producing a consequence. The man went down. The second man came forward, and Voss and Terrell came out of the tree line at a run, And what followed was the ugly, specific violence of people who are not performing, who are operating at the intersection of training and desperation, and the particular adrenaline that comes from knowing that what happens in the next 30 seconds has permanent consequences. Eli pressed himself against a tree at the edge of the light and watched and tried to track everything simultaneously. Graves, the two men, Reyes, the SUVs, his aunt's shape in the back window. Reyes was backing toward the vehicles. His hand was inside his jacket. Eli moved. He moved without deciding to move. The decision happened somewhere below thought, in the part of the brain that operates on a shorter timeline. He came out of the tree line at an angle that put him between Reyes and the SUV, which was not tactically optimal and was also the only thing he could do, because his aunt was in that vehicle and Reyes was backing toward it, and a man backing toward something is a man who intends to use it. "Stop," Eli said. His voice was steadier than he had any right to expect. "Stop moving." Reyes looked at him. At the 11-year-old in the oversized leather jacket standing in a clearing at 4 in the morning with nothing in his hands and nothing behind his words except certainty. "Move, boy," Reyes said. "You're on camera," Eli said. Reyes stopped. "Stitch has been on the ridge since 3:30, Eli said. "Everything that's happened in this clearing since we arrived has been recorded. Your face, the men you brought, the vehicle your men are driving." He held Reyes' gaze. "My dad spent 6 years building a case that could put you away. Graves spent 4 hours tonight making sure it got out. And you drove to this clearing with your face in the open and threatened an 11-year-old. He paused. "You're already done. You just haven't stopped moving yet." Something in Reyes' face shifted again. That same interior collapse, but more complete this time. The recognition of a man who has run the calculation and found that every path leads to the same place and has been finding this for a while now and has been moving anyway, because movement is the only thing that feels like it might change the math. Behind Eli, Graves' voice, "It's over, Reyes." Reyes looked at Graves, then at Eli, then at the jacket. His hand came out of his jacket, empty. He sat down on the gravel. Not dramatically, just sat down, the way a very tired man sits when there's no longer a reason to stay standing, and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground. Graves came up beside Eli. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder, the same placement as in the dark building, steady, anchoring. And for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Graves walked to the SUV and opened the rear door. Eli's aunt came out fast, stumbled on the gravel, caught herself. She was in her coat and boots, and her hair was uncombed, and her face was doing several things at once: relief, terror, anger, and something that was not quite any of those things. The complicated expression of a woman who had spent 6 years trying to protect a child from a truth that the child had gone out and found anyway. She crossed the clearing in about 4 steps and went down on one knee in the gravel, and her arms came around Eli, and she held him the way people hold things they thought they'd lost. Eli let her. He put his face against her shoulder and closed his eyes and breathed and felt the weight of the jacket on his shoulders and his aunt's arms around it, and the cold air on the back of his neck, and the sound of the mountain and the distant highway, and somewhere behind him Graves' voice on the phone, low and efficient, already making the calls that needed to be made. I didn't cry. He was saving that for later, for somewhere private, for the moment when it was actually over, rather than the moment that felt like it might almost be over. His aunt pulled back and looked at his face and said, "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at the jacket. Her hand came up and touched the collar patch, the hidden one, the private one, the marker his father had sewn in himself, and her face did something private and deep. "He told me to send you," she said. "The letter. He told me to send you when the time was right." She looked at Eli steadily. "I waited too long." "You sent me," Eli said. "That's what mattered." She nodded, held herself together with visible effort, stood up. Behind her, in the clearing, Voss had zip-tied the 2 men from the vehicle. Terrell was on the phone. Reyes was still sitting on the gravel with his hands on his knees, and a light was growing in the east. Not dawn yet, the specific pre-dawn that is the darkness acknowledging that something is coming, whether it's ready or not. Graves came back from the vehicles and stopped in front of Eli. He had the memory card in his hand again. He'd taken it from his pocket, was holding it the way he'd held it in the hunting camp, palm closed, something being decided about. "Hale has everything," he said. "The uploads went through clean. He's already making calls. He looked at Eli. By morning, this is going to be loud. Good, Eli said. It's going to involve you, your name, your father's name. I know. You're 11 years old. I know that too. Graves looked at him for a long moment. The pre-dawn light was doing things to the clearing, softening the edges of it, the gravel and the trees and the faces of the men in it, the SUVs, the floodlight which someone had switched off, and which was now just a metal object on a tripod. Everything was becoming visible and was simultaneously becoming something it hadn't been in the dark. Your father said something in that first video, Graves said. He said if you found me, he'd know one of two things had happened. Eli waited. Either things went better than he planned. Graves paused. Or they went exactly as bad as he was afraid they would, and that in either case his boy would be sitting right next to me. He looked down at the card in his palm. He was right about the second part. What was the party planned? Eli asked. Graves opened his hand. In the growing light, the small waterproof casing of the memory card caught the first gray trace of morning and held it. He planned for me to find a way to end this without putting you in the middle of it, Graves said. He planned for the card to reach me through a different route, through a contact he'd set up in Spokane. A clean handoff, no risk to you, no bus ride alone, no clearing at 4 in the morning. His jaw worked. The contact died 8 months ago, heart attack, which is why the letter came to your aunt instead. He paused. Danny spent 6 years trying to find a way to protect you from this. Eli absorbed that. Let it settle into the place where things settle when they're true, and you know they're true and you needed them to be. But it still worked, Eli said. It still worked, Graves said. Somewhere on the ridge, Stitch was making his way down through the trees. Somewhere in a diner in Black Ridge, Marcus Hale was on his third phone call of the morning. Somewhere in a county records archive, a maintenance log from 2001 was about to become the most important document in a 3-state corruption investigation. And somewhere, in a concrete room with a bare bulb and a phone propped on a crate, a man who had been running for 6 years had recorded himself looking into a camera and trusting that the people on the other side of it would be exactly who he believed them to be. The sun was beginning, not visible yet, but coming. The sky to the east going from black to a dark blue, the mountain edges becoming distinct, the trees separating from the sky. And then every phone in the clearing buzzed at once. Graves checked his screen. His face changed. What? Eli said. Graves turned the screen so Eli could see it. It was a news alert, early, raw, the kind that goes out before a story is fully written, just the headline and the first 3 lines. The source was a regional news wire. The headline read, Major Corruption Case Breaking, Merit Holdings Linked to 2001. Alderman Facility Deaths, Federal Investigation Opening. Below it, a second alert, arriving as they read the first. This one from a different source. The headline read, Iron Covenant MC member Danny Mercer, missing 6 years, confirmed alive by federal sources, whereabouts unknown. Eli read it twice. He read the word alive and felt it move through him in a way he didn't have a container for yet, a feeling that was too large and too complicated and too new to be processed, standing in a gravel clearing in the Montana pre-dawn with his aunt's hand on his shoulder and a stranger's jacket on his back. Alive. His father was alive. He looked up at Graves, who was already looking at him, and the expression on the man's face was the most unguarded thing Eli had seen from him. Not the perimeter assessment, not the controlled levelness, not the careful management of a man who had learned to keep the important things internal. Something that had been waiting 6 years to be allowed out, and was now, tentatively, cautiously, allowing itself to exist. Behind them, at the edge of the clearing, Reyes finally spoke. His voice was flat and old and very tired. I don't know where he is, he said. I want you to know that. I spent 4 years trying to find him, and I never could. He said it to the gravel. He was better at running than I was at finding. Nobody responded. He was always better than me at most things, Reyes said. That's the truth, for whatever it's worth. Graves looked at the man on the gravel for a long moment. It's worth nothing, he said quietly. And it's worth nothing because 32 people are dead, and a man spent 6 years in exile, and his son rode a Greyhound bus alone in December to find people who might help him, and all of that could have been different if you'd made one different choice in 2001. He paused. So no, it's worth nothing, But I heard you say it. Reyes nodded. Once. And went back to looking at the ground. The light was growing. The mountain was fully visible now, the snow on its upper face going from gray to something almost white, the first cold color of a new morning spreading across it from east to west. Graves turned back to Eli. We need to move, he said. Federal contacts will be mobilizing. Merritt's people will be moving. There are going to be people coming to this location in the next hour, and some of them are going to be the right people and some of them aren't, and we need to be somewhere controlled before that happens. Where? Eli said. Back to Black Ridge, Graves said, to the garage, where there are 40 bikes and 40 men and a wall with your father's name on it. He looked at the boy steadily. And where, before the day is out, we are going to need to make some decisions about what comes next. For who? Eli said. For you, Graves said. For your father, when we find him. For what the club does with whatever this turns into. He paused. And for what you do with the rest of your life, once the people who are using it as a weapon are no longer in a position to do that. Eli looked at the jacket on his shoulders, at the collar turned back where the hidden patch was visible in the morning light, clearer now than it had been in the garage, in the dark building, in the hunting camp. Just a small thing, stitched in thread so dark it almost disappeared, a private marker that had carried a dead man's evidence and a living man's last instructions and a boy's 200-mile hope across a winter that was finally, in some direction that hadn't quite arrived yet, beginning to break. He reached up and turned the collar back down, covered the patch. Okay, he said, let's go back. They mounted up. The engines turned over in the thin morning air, big, deliberate, unapologetic. Eli climbed behind Graves and put his arms around the man's waist, and his aunt climbed behind Voss, which she did without comment and without hesitation, which said something about what the last several hours had recalibrated in her. The column moved out of the clearing and onto the county road and turned south toward Black Ridge. The sun broke the mountain's edge. It came in cold and horizontal and very clear, the specific quality of winter morning light that finds everything and illuminates it without warmth. Not yet. Warmth would come later. Warmth required time. But the light itself was sufficient. It was enough to see by. Graves opened the throttle. The road unrolled ahead of them, 2 lanes of empty highway in the first full light of morning, the mountains on both sides, the sky above going from pink to blue with the systematic confidence of something that has been doing this every day for longer than anyone can count, and intends to keep doing it regardless of what the people beneath it get up to. Eli pressed his face against the wind and felt the jacket around him, heavy, worn, shaped by years of someone else's body before his, carrying evidence and history and a dead man's careful preparation. And he held on. Behind them, in the clearing, the gravel held the marks of what had happened there. And 30 miles ahead, in a garage where 40 motorcycles sat and a wall held the names of the absent, the morning was arriving whether anyone was ready for it or not. And in a concrete room somewhere that nobody had yet located, on a phone with a dying battery, a man who had been running for 6 years was reading a news alert on a cracked screen, and his hands were shaking, and the word he read over and over was the same word his son had read 20 minutes ago in a different clearing under the same new sun. Alive. He was still alive. And for the first time in 6 years, being alive felt like the beginning of something rather than the condition of an ongoing emergency. He reached for the phone to make a call he had not been able to make in 6 years, and his hands were shaking too badly to dial on the first try. And he tried again, and the line connected. And on the other end of it, riding south on a 2-lane highway in the Montana morning with an 11-year-old holding on behind him, Gideon Cross felt his phone buzz in his chest pocket and knew, before he reached for it, exactly who it was. Graves pulled over when the phone buzzed. He didn't do it dramatically, just eased off the throttle and guided the bike to the shoulder of the highway in one smooth motion, the gravel crunching under the tires, the column behind him reading the signal and slowing without being told. The sun was fully up now, low and winter cold on the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the road that pointed west like fingers. He reached into his chest pocket and looked at the screen. Unknown number. Montana area code. A town he didn't recognize. He answered it. Silence for 2 seconds. The kind of silence that is not empty, the kind that is full of someone trying to find where to start. Then, Gideon. One word. a voice that had aged a decade in 6 years, roughened and worn, and carrying something underneath it that Graves recognized the way you recognize the smell of a place you grew up. Not consciously, not with analysis, just immediately and completely, and with your whole body. He got off the bike. He walked 4 steps away from it and stood on the shoulder of the highway with the cold wind coming off the mountain and his hand tight around the phone, and he said, very quietly, "Danny." Behind him, Eli had not moved. He was still on the bike, 1 foot on the ground, watching Graves' back. He watched the set of the man's shoulders, the way they had carried everything since the garage in Black Ridge, the perimeter assessment and the controlled levelness, and the weight of a plan executed in darkness under time pressure. And he watched what happened to them now. They didn't drop exactly. They didn't relax. Something more specific happened, something that Eli had seen in his aunt's face when she'd come out of the SUV and found him standing in the clearing. The specific physical consequence of something that has been held too long, finally being allowed to be put down. Graves said very little during the call. He said yes twice, and I know, once, and we have it, it's done. And then he was quiet for a long time, listening, and Eli watched his profile, the jaw, the scar, the winter sky eyes, and tried not to listen and failed entirely. When the call ended, Graves stood on the shoulder of the highway for another 30 seconds before he turned around. He looked at Eli. His face was doing things that Eli suspected it had not done in public for a very long time. "He's in Missoula," Graves said. "He's been there for 3 weeks. He came back to Montana when the documents went to your aunt. He said..." He stopped, started again. "He said he needed to be close when it happened, in case it went wrong." Eli's heart was doing the fist thing again. "Is he... He's okay. He's..." Graves stopped for the 3rd time and made a decision about something internal. "He wants to talk to you." He held out the phone. Eli took it. It was warm from Graves' hand. He held it to his ear, and for a moment there was just the sound of the highway and the wind and his own breathing, and then the line connected, and he said, "Dad?" What happened next was private. Eli turned toward the mountain and put his free hand in the pocket of the oversized jacket and talked to his father, and the column of bikers behind him did what men like that do when they encounter a moment that belongs entirely to someone else. They found things to do. Cork walked to the far side of the road. Decker checked his tire pressure. Stitch lit a cigarette and looked at the sky with the professional detachment of a man who was absolutely not listening. Graves walked back to the bike and sat on it and looked at the road ahead and felt the specific weight of 6 years redistributing itself into something that had a different shape than it had carried before. Not lighter, exactly. Different. The way a scar is different from a wound. Same material, reorganized. The call lasted 11 minutes. When Eli walked back to the bike, his eyes were red, and he was not going to mention that, and nobody was going to mention it either. He handed the phone back to Graves. "He said to tell you he owes you 17 years of drinks." "He owes me nothing," Graves said. "He said you'd say that." "Then he knows me well enough that he should have just not mentioned it." Eli climbed back onto the bike. He settled into the space behind Graves and put his hands at the man's waist, and when Graves started the engine and felt the boy's grip steady and certain, he pulled back onto the highway and opened the throttle and didn't say anything else for a while because some things don't require words, and this was one of them. They reached Black Ridge at 7:40 in the morning. The town was already changed in the way that small towns change when something large moves through them. Not the buildings or the streets. Those were identical, but the quality of attention on them. There were vehicles parked on the main strip that hadn't been there yesterday. A news van from a Billings affiliate. 2 dark sedans with government plates that announced themselves by trying not to announce themselves. The diner had its lights on and its door propped open, and the smell of coffee and bacon fat came out onto the sidewalk in the cold morning air like an invitation. Marcus Hale was standing outside Rourke's garage when they pulled in. I was younger than Eli had expected from the way the men talked about him. Mid-30s maybe, with the specific physical quality of someone who spent a lot of time in cars and not enough time sleeping. He had a recorder in his hand and a notebook under his arm, and the expression of a man who has just received, in the course of a single overnight, more than 3 years of accumulated effort validated at once, and is still processing what that means for his understanding of his own patience. He looked at Graves, then at Eli. "The boy," he said. "His name is Eli Mercer," Graves said, "and he's not talking to you today." I wasn't today, Graves said. We clear? Hale held up both hands. We're clear. He paused. The federal field office in Great Falls is opening a formal investigation. They called me for sourcing 20 minutes ago. I gave them what I could. Another pause. Merritt's attorney issued a statement at 6:30. Denied everything. Standard architecture. How long before that architecture falls down? Graves said. Hale considered it. The financial records alone, without the video? Months. Maybe more. These things move slowly. He looked at the recorder in his hand. With the video? Gerald Merritt will have federal agents at his door before noon. The video shows his face, his voice, his operational language. It's not ambiguous. A pause. Where did it come from? 6 years of careful work by a man who didn't have anything left except time and the truth, Graves said. Put that in your article. Hale wrote it down. Verbatim, which Graves noticed. Inside Rourke's garage, the men who had been there yesterday for the memorial ride had not gone anywhere. Some had slept on the floor or in the clubhouse on the old leather couch. Some hadn't slept. The room held that quality of a space where people have been through something together and haven't yet processed the full dimensions of what they came through. A compound awareness, exhausted and alert simultaneously, the specific post-event state of men who have been trained to debrief and are waiting for the right moment. Cork was making coffee on the single burner in the corner. He handed Eli a cup without being asked, which was not something Cork did, and Eli took it and held the warmth of it in both hands and sat down on the arm of the old leather couch. You did good, Cork said. Not a compliment exactly, the statement of an observer. He said it looking at the floor, which made it more genuine than if he'd made eye contact. I didn't do much, Eli said. You stood between Reyes and that vehicle without anything in your hands. Cork poured his own cup. That's more than most people do. He drank. Your dad would have done exactly the same thing, which is either a compliment or a warning, depending on how you look at it. Eli almost smiled. Almost. The federal agents arrived at 9:15, two of them, credentials from the Great Falls field office. Professionally courteous in the way that federal agents are professionally courteous when they are in a situation where they need cooperation and are aware of it. They wanted the memory card. Graves gave them a copy. The photographs Decker had taken of each document page, transferred to a clean drive, and told them the original was in the possession of a certified journalist with a chain of custody established before their arrival, which meant that any attempt to suppress the originals would encounter the specific problem of material that was already in the public record. The agents appreciated this. Not visibly, but they appreciated it. One of them, younger, with careful eyes, looked at Eli when they were leaving and said, "Is this the Mercer boy?" "Yes," Graves said. The agent nodded at Eli. It was not a nod that contained anything specific, no information, no reassurance. Just an acknowledgement. You exist. I see you. What happened to your family was real and is now being formally recognized as real. It was a small thing, and it was also, for reasons Eli couldn't fully articulate, the first official thing that had ever acknowledged any of this, and small as it was, it landed. Thank you, Eli said. The agent nodded again and left. At 10 in the morning, Danny Mercer's name appeared in a national wire story for the first time in 6 years. Not as a fugitive, not as a person of interest, as a material witness and primary source in an opening federal investigation into fraud, bribery, and criminal negligence, resulting in 32 deaths. The wire story used the word vindicated in its second paragraph, which was not a word federal press releases used, and which meant Hale had reached someone with access to the language being used internally. Stitch showed Graves the alert on his phone. Graves read it once and handed the phone back. That's one word, he said. Better than the alternative, Stitch said. 23 years better, Graves agreed. The families of the 32 alderman workers were mentioned in the fourth paragraph of the wire story. 23 years of those families having been told it was an accident, that the collapse was structural, that the tragedy was the result of aging infrastructure and insufficient federal maintenance budgets. 23 years of some of them having believed it, and some of them having not believed it, and all of them having lived with the specific grief of a death that the world had decided to make convenient. Graves sat with that for a long time, in the way that a person sits with something that is both better than nothing and nowhere near sufficient. At 11, a car arrived from Missoula. Eli was standing outside the garage with his aunt when it pulled into the lot. A 10-year-old Honda, road-worn, nothing remarkable about it. It parked at the far edge of the gravel. The door opened. His aunt made a sound beside him, small, involuntary, the kind of sound that happens before the conscious mind has finished processing what the eyes are reporting. The man who got out of the car was not the man in the photograph on the garage wall. Not the young one, the 23-year-old with his father's jaw and his arms around his brothers on a mountain road. He was 41 years old, and he looked like someone who had carried a very heavy thing for a very long time, and had not yet had the chance to put it down completely. And he walked across the gravel lot the way people walk when they are trying to move normally and their body is not entirely cooperating. He stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at Eli, at the jacket, at his son's face. Eli looked back at him. The distance between 10 feet and 0 feet can be a very long way. It was, in this case. It was 6 years, and a bus ride, and a garage in winter, and a clearing at 4 in the morning, and a phone call on the side of a highway, and everything that had happened to both of them in the time that was supposed to be the ordinary accumulation of a shared life. Danny Mercer crossed it. He went down on one knee in the gravel the way Eli's aunt had done in the clearing, and his hands came up and cupped his son's face. And he looked at him for a long time without speaking, just looked. The way you look at something you thought you might never see again, and are now recalibrating the entire architecture of the future around the fact that you are seeing it. "Hey, bud," he said. His voice was wrecked. He made no effort to fix it. "Hey, Dad," Eli said. His voice was also wrecked. He also made no effort. They stayed like that for a moment, the man on his knees and the boy standing, and then Eli leaned forward and put his forehead against his father's shoulder, and his father's arms came around him in the jacket, all of it, both of them inside the leather that had carried the evidence that had carried the truth across 6 years of someone trying to bury it. Nobody watching said anything. The men who had gathered at the garage bay entrance turned one by one and found other things to look at: the sky, the highway, the mountains. Cork walked back inside. Stitch examined something on his motorcycle with intense focus. Decker produced a rag and began wiping a windshield that was already clean. Graves stood at the edge of the lot. He watched Danny and Eli, and he felt the particular quality of a thing completing. Not simply ending, completing, the way a structure achieves its intended form after years of construction, and the shape that was always implicit in the materials finally becomes visible. He'd been a part of this family in the way that brothers are part of each other's families, and he'd lost that when Danny disappeared, and he had not acknowledged how much that loss had cost him, because acknowledging it required feeling it, and feeling it had not been compatible with the operational reality of those 6 years. He acknowledged it now, briefly, internally, in the space between one breath and the next. Then he folded it into himself and moved forward. Danny stood up when he heard Graves' boots on the gravel. He turned. The two men looked at each other. Across the lot, across 6 years, across the specific distance between a death that was told and a life that had kept moving in the gap between what was told and what was true. Danny reached out his hand. Graves took it, held it, and then pulled the man in, one hand on his shoulder, brief and hard, the specific economy of men who have been trained not to demonstrate things and are demonstrating something anyway. "You look like hell," Graves said. "You look old," Danny said. "Same thing." They stood with a foot between them and the morning light on both their faces, and nothing more was said for a moment, because nothing more was needed. Danny's eyes went to the jacket on Eli's shoulders. "It fit?" he said. "Not even close," Eli said. "Give it time." "Is that a promise?" Danny looked at his son, and the thing that moved across his face was not any single emotion, but the compound of all of them: relief, guilt, love, grief, the specific devastation of time that cannot be recovered, and the simultaneous understanding that time still ahead is something different from time already spent. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's a promise." The afternoon moved slowly, which was a mercy. Federal investigators came and went. Hale sat in the diner and made calls and typed things, and occasionally walked out to ask Graves questions that Graves answered with the precision of a man who had decided that the truth was the most efficient path and was following it consistently. Danny sat inside the garage with Eli and his sister, who had driven from Billings herself at 7 in the morning, not waiting to be asked, simply getting in her car and coming, and they talked, or they didn't talk, or they sat with coffee, and the specific texture of people who are in the early hours of something that will take years to fully work through and are being patient with themselves about that. At 2 in the afternoon, news came that Gerald Merritt had been taken into federal custody at his residence outside of Black Ridge. No resistance. His attorney had advised him that the weight of the documented evidence made any other posture untenable. He had walked out of his house in a good coat and gotten into the back of a federal vehicle, and the image of it, taken by a photographer from the Billings Gazette who happened to be passing on the road, went national by 3 o'clock. Reyes was already in custody, transported from the clearing at the Alderman Junction to the Great Falls field office by 7 in the morning. Warren Dale Lowell, who had spent 20 years building himself a position of access inside systems he was never meant to access, sat in an interrogation room and said nothing for 4 hours, and then, when his attorney arrived, said everything, because the evidence was arranged against him in the specific way that makes calculation impossible, and the only remaining variable is the degree of cooperation. The Iron Covenant Network issued a formal statement through its regional leadership disavowing Lowell's appointment and opening an internal investigation into the 18 months of compromised communications. Graves read the statement and found it sufficient, and said so in a phone call to the regional president that lasted 4 minutes and was mostly silence on both ends, which was also sufficient. The names of the 32 alderman workers were read on the evening news by a Montana public broadcaster who had covered the original collapse in 2001 as a young reporter, and who read the names now with the specific quality of someone returning to something they had never entirely let go of. Graves watched it on Stitch's phone in the garage, all 8 minutes of it, standing very still. When it was done, he handed the phone back to Stitch. "I need a drink," Cork said from somewhere behind them. "You need about 4, Stitch said. "I need exactly 4, Cork agreed, "and I need somebody else to count them because I lost the ability to count after midnight." The diner across the street served beer. They went as a group, all of them who were still in Black Ridge, all of them who had been through the last 36 hours, the Riders and Danny and Eli and his aunt, and one journalist who had been told he could have 1 beer and no recorder, and agreed to those terms with the practiced agreeableness of someone who knew better than to push. They took up 3 tables pushed together in the center of the diner, and the owner, a woman in her 60s who had seen a great deal of Black Ridge's history and maintained her own counsel about most of it, brought coffee and beer without being asked, and then left them alone. The conversation that happened at those 3 tables was not the kind that gets recorded or repeated with precision. It was the kind that moves laterally, from the operational events of the previous night to older things, older stories, the accumulated material of men who had known each other for decades and were processing a shared experience by remembering other shared experiences. Danny talked. Not everything. Not all 6 years in one sitting, because that was not how 6 years worked. But some of it. The way it had felt at first to be running. The specific discipline of staying invisible. The months where he'd considered giving up, and the thing that had stopped him each time, which was not courage exactly, but stubbornness, which in his honest accounting were sometimes the same thing. Eli listened to his father's voice across the table and watched his face and tried to map the man he was hearing onto the father he had constructed over 6 years from photographs and his aunt's careful, minimal accounting. They didn't match exactly. The real version was older and rougher and more tired, and also, in ways Eli hadn't expected, funnier. His father made 2 dry, quiet jokes in the first hour that caught Eli off guard enough that he laughed before he'd processed them, and both times his father looked at him with an expression that was completely open, unguarded, the expression of a man who has been given back something he thought was gone. At one point, Graves, who had been quiet for a stretch, looked at Danny across the tables and said, "The contact in Spokane. Burns." "Yeah," Danny said. "You should have told me he was the backup." "I know." "If I'd known there was a backup, I would have looked for one when he died." "I know," Danny said again. He looked at his beer. "I was trying to keep you insulated. If you didn't know the backup existed, you couldn't be pressured about it. I also couldn't find you." "Also that." He was quiet for a moment. "I made mistakes. I made a lot of them. The biggest one was Burns. I should have had 2 backups. I should have had 3. He looked at Graves. "You would have had 3. "I would have had 5, Graves said. "That's why you're better at this than me. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." Cork, who had been counting his drinks and losing count and starting over, set his fourth beer down with the authority of a man making a definitive statement. "For the record," he said, looking at Eli, "I had doubts when you walked in. I want you to know I'm aware of that." Eli looked at him. "Okay. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't skeptical. You don't have to. But I'm also not going to pretend—" Cork stopped, started again. "Your dad was one of ours. That means something. It meant something when we thought he was dead, and it means something now." He picked his beer back up. "That's all I wanted to say." It was not an apology exactly. It was also exactly an apology. "Okay," Eli said. "Thank you." Cork nodded and drank and found something on the far wall to look at. Eli's aunt, who had spent most of the afternoon in the specific quiet of a woman processing an enormous volume of emotion with great internal efficiency, leaned over to Eli at some point and said, low enough for just the two of them, "I should have sent you sooner." "You sent me when you could," Eli said. "I was afraid." "I know." "I was afraid of exactly what happened," she said. "And it happened. And you're okay. And your dad is across the table." She looked at her hands. "I'm going to need to think about what to do with that." "Take your time," Eli said. She looked at him with the expression she'd worn in the clearing, the complicated one, the one that contained relief and years of careful protection and the recognition that the child she'd been guarding had, at some point while she was guarding him, become someone capable of things she hadn't planned for. "When did you get so old?" she said. "Bus ride," Eli said. At some point in the evening, after the food had come and been eaten and the conversation had moved through several more rooms of memory and weight and occasional laughter, Graves looked across the table at Eli and said, "Your dad told me something on the phone this morning, before you talked to him." Eli waited. "He said he'd been thinking about it. For a long time." Graves turned his beer slowly on the table. A habit Eli had noticed was his way of organizing his thoughts. "He said he didn't want to make decisions about your life without asking you, but that he'd been hoping, if things worked out, that you might consider Black Ridge." He paused. "He has money. He's been working construction under a different name for 6 years, and he's careful with what he earns. There's enough to get set up here, to get you into school here." He looked at Eli steadily. "He said he wanted to ask you himself, but he was afraid to, and he asked me if I'd mention it first, to see how you felt about the idea." Eli looked at his father across the tables. Danny was talking to Decker about something mechanical. There was hand geometry happening, the shape of an engine component being described in three-dimensional space. "I was laughing at something," Decker said, and the laugh was the laugh Eli had imagined from photographs, and the fact that it matched was something he was going to need to sit with for a long time before it became real. "Black Ridge?" Eli said. "It's not much of a town," Graves said. "I won't tell you otherwise. It has a garage. It has a garage. And the diner. And the diner." Graves paused. "And 40 people who know what your name means." He said it simply, without weight, as a statement of fact. "That's worth something." Eli thought about his aunt's house in Billings, about his room there, which was adequate and safe, and which had never entirely felt like his in the way rooms are supposed to feel. He thought about the bus ride, and the snow, and the 40 minutes standing outside a garage where nobody would talk to him, and about what it had felt like when Graves had walked across the lot and crouched down to eye level and waited for an actual answer to an actual question. "Yeah," he said, "that's worth something." Graves nodded, drank his coffee, let it rest. The diner held them all for another hour. The low light and the smell of coffee and the winter dark outside the windows and the sound of men who had been through something together, making the transition from through it to past it, which is never as clean as the words suggest, but is nonetheless real. Eli held his father's jacket in his lap under the table. He'd taken it off when they came inside. It was warm in the diner. And he'd folded it the way his aunt had always folded it, the way he'd carried it on the bus, and set it on his knees the way you hold something you're not quite ready to put down. He ran his thumb along the collar, the hidden patch under the fold, its compass rose pointing toward something that had taken 6 years and 200 miles to locate, and was now, in the specific way of things that get found, in the process of becoming something other than a destination. At 9 o'clock, they walked out into the Black Ridge night. The temperature had dropped further, proper Montana winter, the kind that meant business. And the stars were out, which happened here with a density and clarity that people who grew up in cities found difficult to believe. The highway ran through town and out the other side and into the dark, and the mountains sat where they always sat, enormous and indifferent and permanent. The bikes were still in the lot. Some of the riders were heading home tonight, long rides back to their own towns, their own chapters, their own ordinary lives that had been interrupted for a memorial ride and had become something considerably less ordinary. Graves walked Eli and Danny to Danny's car. Danny had his hand on his son's shoulder, and Eli let it be there, which was still new enough that Eli was aware of it with a part of his mind that ran parallel to everything else. The weight of it. The specific heat of a hand that was his father's hand. At the car, Danny looked at Graves and said, "I owe you more than I can say." "We've established that the debt concept doesn't apply here," Graves said. "It applies." "It doesn't." "Gideon," Graves looked at him. "You asked me once, a long time ago, what the club meant. You were drunk, and it was a bad question, but you were 23 and I didn't hold it against you." He paused. "You want to know what I told you?" "You told me it meant you didn't have to explain yourself to people who already understood you." "That's still what it means," Graves said. "So stop trying to explain yourself." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. And the nod was sufficient. The way silences and nods and turning back to the car are sufficient between people who have been through enough together that sufficiency is its own language. They drove to the motel at the north end of town. Danny had a room booked, had done it from Missoula before he'd known tonight would go the way it went. And Eli rode with his father in the car, and his aunt followed in her own car, and Graves watched them go and then turned back to the garage. The lot was quieter now, half the bikes gone. Cork had loaded his and was lashing his saddlebag with the methodical care of a man who did everything methodically and was using the familiar activity as a way to decompress. Stitch was doing something to his exhaust with a wrench that it probably didn't need but that occupied his hands. Decker came and stood beside Graves. "What happens now?" he said. "Investigation runs," Graves said. "Merritt's attorneys make it slow. Reyes cooperates, which shortens it. The families of the 32 get attorneys and file civil suits, which is its own long road." He looked at the highway. "The network issue gets addressed. The compromised communications get audited. Trust gets rebuilt, which takes longer than everything else." "And the kid?" "He stays. His dad stays." Graves paused. "If they want to." "You want them to." It was not a question. Decker was not generally a man who used questions when statements were available. Graves didn't answer it, which was also an answer. In the morning, he went to the garage before anyone else arrived, and he stood in front of the photograph wall. Found the frame with the circle in black marker. The faded one, the old one. The circle drawn around a young man's face in the year that the club had believed it had lost him. He took the frame off the wall carefully and set it on the workbench and, with a utility knife, removed the black circle line, cutting it away from the photograph's border a section at a time until it was gone. He cleaned the glass with a cloth and rehung the frame. Danny Mercer's face in 1997, 23 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. No circle, just present. Like he'd been there all along, like he'd never stopped being there. Graves stood back and looked at it and drank his coffee. The first coffee of the morning, the best one, the one that tasted the way mornings should taste before the day's complications arrive. And in the empty garage with the winter light coming cold and clear through the high windows, he felt the previous day begin the long process of becoming the past. At 7 o'clock, boots on the gravel outside. 2 sets. One adult, one smaller. The door opened. Eli came in first, still wearing the jacket. The enormous jacket, the shoulder seams at his elbows, the hem at his knees, the hidden patch under the collar still pointing wherever it pointed. Behind him, Danny, with 2 paper cups of coffee from the diner across the street. Eli looked at the photograph wall, found the frame, found his father's face without the circle. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned to Graves. "You took it off," he said. "Didn't need it anymore," Graves said. Eli looked at the photograph again, at the group of young men on a mountain road, the snow in the distance, the specific quality of a moment that had no idea what was coming and was glad of it. "Tonight," he stopped. "Can I come back? After school starts. On weekends. Can I—" "Kid," Graves said. You can come back whenever you want. I don't want to. Eli. He waited for the boy to look at him. This is where you belong. You don't need to ask. Danny stood at the door with the coffee cups and said nothing, because this was not a moment that needed him. He had a lot of those ahead of him, moments that were for his son and other people, moments he had missed that were now happening in his presence because he was present, which was the thing he had been working toward for 6 years and which was now, improbably, actually occurring. He handed Graves a coffee. Graves took it. The three of them stood in the garage in the winter morning, in the smell of oil and cold metal and fresh coffee. And outside on the highway, the occasional vehicle passed in either direction carrying the ordinary freight of ordinary lives. And the mountain stood where they always stood. And somewhere in a federal records archive, the Alderman facility was in the process of becoming officially real again after 23 years of official forgetting. And in offices across the state, men who had believed themselves protected were revising their understanding of what protection meant. And in a garage in Black Ridge, Montana, the jacket that had traveled 6 years to find the right hands hung on the boy who had carried it there. A little large still, room to grow into. Graves drank his coffee. The morning went on. The engines would start again soon. They always did. But for now, in this particular morning, in this specific light, the garage was quiet and warm enough, and the people inside it were exactly where they were supposed to be, and that was sufficient. That was, against all odds and at considerable cost, and with the specific improbability of things that shouldn't work but do, exactly sufficient.